Matthew asks, how much do we know about Putin's early life before he joined the KGB? Was he subject to any of the unhealthy developmental influences that are known to cause malignant narcissism or sociopathy? I know, I think we know that he did have kind of a traumatic childhood. There's a whole story about his mother. I don't know if any of you want to speak to that, but that's certainly something that seems relevant.
Yes, his mother is said to have fainted from starvation. His father was almost killed in the war, and he lived in a communal apartment with two other families where he would encounter rats all the time along whenever he um, climbed the stairwell. And there was a stick hanging so that he could help free the way. There was no hot water and no hot, bathtub. Yes, all this is, well, it's consistent with Leningrad during the time after World War II. And so it seems very much a true story. Of course, he spins it in a way that makes him appear heroic, but what he doesn't reveal is just how much it has wounded him and damaged him. Of course, they would do anything not to reveal that, but we see that obviously the wounds were there. Violent individuals do not arise without being hurt themselves. So hurt people do hurt people.
Yep, that makes sense. And certainly, being in that context, in the post-war, kind of realm, when things were really tough in Russia, I mean, it certainly would make sense that he would be traumatized by that. So you can at least understand how that happened.
How do these people, where do we find them? How are they made? There is some evidence that some people are just born with bad genes. But mostly my experience is cult leaders are born into an authoritarian family or society or cult and get out, but never get deprogrammed, never understand what happened to them. And because they had this upbringing, they never had the love, the safety, the security to develop a healthy sense of self in their childhood. And so everything that happens later in a cult leader is about compensating for this. The grandiose self-centered behavior, fantasies of power, success and attractiveness, need for constant praise and admiration. The sense of entitlement and lack of empathy is critical, being unable to feel. And we can see this in Ukraine, that Putin is demonstrating extremes of this. This is the malignant side, and malignant narcissism, Eric Fromm came up with that term. Anyway, thinking you're above the law, antisocial behavior, pathological lying, exploitation, sadism, harassing, violent, paranoid, inability to trust. So all of these things are characteristics of cult leaders. And I do believe Vladimir Putin is a cult leader.
I also wanted to show this excellent book called First Person, an astonishingly frank self-portrait. And it's very striking because it's Putin in his words alone, almost. And you can see how the interviewers are interpreting him as astonishingly frank, whereas what I see is masterful manipulation. Projecting himself with just the right amount of modesty, just amount of stoicism, and as well as turning his background of destitution and desperation around in a way that would make him appear heroic, and being very understated about it. So extraordinarily masterful, but we can never tell that any bit of it is true. These are detected through patterns, and it comes from a great deal of clinical experience of understanding the underlying psychopathology that allows this kind of prowess that happens, if you will. Hervey Cleckley called this the mask of insanity. In other words, or the mask of sanity. In other words, we have someone who is very disordered, debilitated, and impaired. But because they're so skillful at projecting themselves, when you totally lack a conscience, when you totally lack the kinds of human bonds and emotions that other people have or are driven by, then you can mimic and concoct the most ideal appearance without any compunction whatsoever.
In 10 days, the film, Putin's Palace, racks up over 100 million views. By February, it's been seen by a quarter of Russia's adult population. It reveals the existence of a secret palace on the Black Sea that allegedly belongs to the Russian president.
Putin for years have maintained this ascetic image, you know, like he only works for Russia 24/7 and he doesn't care about riches, material things, you know.
Таким образом, если вы спросите, ну а сколько в итоге стоит дворец Путина под Геленджиком? На счета дворца и виноградников поступило 35 миллиардов рублей. Очень важный объект – церковь. Не храм Минобороны, конечно, но и вообще не очень православным. Справа видим 2 вертолетные площадки. Странно, раньше-то их было 3. Одну убрали. Действительно, ну зачем нужен дворец, в котором нельзя играть в хоккей?
Putin's approval rating has a 6 percentage point dip in 3-4 weeks after the movie was released.
Вот пара реальных предметов мебели из путинских интерьеров. Такой кожаный диван стоит 2 миллиона рублей.
People actually realize that this is essentially a maniac preoccupied with luxury.
As damaging as the revelations of personal greed are the details about the palace itself. Gold toilet brushes worth 700 euros each, a retractable stripper pole, and a room for playing with toy cars.
Путин стал смешным. До этого он все время был страшным, а тут он стал смешным. Историю уже не отмотает, уже в сознании людей. Путин маленький человек, который любит играть в машинки, в этой кальянной несчастной. Он стал жалким и смешным. И он будет таким теперь всегда.
Now that the mask has fallen off of Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine turns out to be not the cold, calculating, maybe even peace-loving person that Putin projected himself to be, but rather an irrational, self-destructive person who couldn't seem to have figured out that he wasn't quite prepared to lead in this war. And especially in the beginning of the war, he seemed almost to subscribe to delusional beliefs, such as that he was going to invade this country because it's not really a country, or that they were targeting Russia, or that they were full of Nazis and committing genocide. And we can easily see that these are not normal modes of thinking. He's very much self-destructive, but destructive of others along the way. And we can see a great deal of his psychology in how he is manifesting in terms of not only in terms of what he projects onto Ukraine, but what he unfolds in Ukraine. One eventually manifests outwardly what has been going on inwardly. So we ourselves are experiencing very much the kind of warfare and struggles and chaos that has been going on inside his head, no matter the mask that he has put on. Often the question comes up, is this insanity? Well, insanity defined by eventual self-destructiveness, no matter how one believes that one is advantaging oneself through one's actions, or even in the belief of self-preservation, we find that those who are disordered and those we label as being diseased are actually do behave this way, and often you find that they project their own mental impairments onto others, and we find with the Nazi genocide, for example, they or even the way that the Soviets dealt with dissidents, that they often label others, healthy others, as being disordered.
What might we expect from Vladimir Putin as he is increasingly cornered and faced with what appears to be the reality that, the Russian army is not 12 feet tall. They are not conquering in the way that they thought they would, not even close. And it's unclear that, Russia's future might even be intact at this point. Like it's really not clear where this is going. So, I know some people that, think that, a malignant narcissist is going to be very intent on their own self-preservation at all costs. And certainly we do see that kind of behavior sometimes. But at the same time, when they are feeling cornered, I think, people like Jim Jones or David Koresh or Adolf Hitler might be perhaps better blueprints to follow in terms of what malignant narcissism does when cornered.
When reality threatens a narcissist or a sociopath's self-concept, it may cause them to feel weak and inadequate, which they then attempt to alleviate by creating alternate realities and revisionist histories, or by attempting to project strength. Unfortunately, sociopaths equate strength with cruelty and inhumanity, and this is exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine. As far as Putin, I think it's important to view Putin's psychological profile through the lens of the great man theory. The great man theory of leadership states that great leaders are born with exceptional attributes that set them apart from others, and that these traits are responsible for them assuming positions of power and authority. According to the great man theory, a leader is a hero who accomplishes goals against all odds for his followers, and that the history of the world is but a biography of these great men. With that as a backdrop, if Putin saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and viewed himself as the great man to rectify that catastrophe, then it is unlikely that his psyche will be able to handle not just the failure of rectifying that catastrophe, but the reality that he destroyed Russia and made it exponentially worse than it was after the fall of the Soviet Union. If this is the eventual outcome of the war, then actual death may be irrelevant compared to the death of Putin's ego. Similar to the Kims in North Korea, sociopathic and narcissistic authoritarians project a manufactured mythical aura of greatness and omnipotence. Putin does this to the point of staging fake hockey games against former professional hockey players, where a 60-something-year-old Putin dominates by scoring 8 of his team's 13 goals, and of course, he wins. Putin has a pathological need or impulse to avoid the shame and the humiliation of the loss, and to avoid the piercing of his grandiosity, to avoid the piercing and the fallacy of his brilliance and decision-making, and to avoid the piercing of the perception of his strength, which, as I pointed out earlier, is viewed synonymously with cruelty and inhumanity. The decades-long existence of alternate realities combined with a pathologically fragile ego and nearly unchallenged authority create a very dangerous situation when that alternate reality is pierced. If actual reality prevents Putin from having the ability to create or impose alternate realities, he may view a Jim Jones-like murder-suicide as the ultimate alternate reality. This is because anyone he kills won't be around to ruminate in the actual reality of his infamy.
These extreme narcissists, in fact, there's a spectrum that we can see from pathological narcissism to malignant narcissism to sociopathy. They all occur along a spectrum. And what we see is that even though they incur such destruction on the world, and it looks like they would do anything for self-preservation, the core of them is actually destructive. And in the end, they are prone to being destructive not only of others, but also of themselves. Their suicide rates are higher than the general population, just as their homicide rates are higher. And I've dealt with many of these individuals, mostly in prison settings, because I specialize in treating violent offenders. They often engage in self-mutilation and, as I said, are at risk of self-destruction. So to believe that just because they have taken a win-at-all-cost approach and have seemed to be preserving themselves at the expense of everyone else, they are actually doing it in a disordered way, and that they eventually destroy themselves also, and that they would do anything for psychic survival, especially those who have narcissistic traits are going to hold their self-image above anything else, and they would rather destroy the world and destroy themselves than to damage their self-image, and that will take precedence even to physical survival.
Got it. So just to clarify that, do you think that, Putin would get to a point where he would, in some way endanger his own safety as long as it meant that like nobody else won either? Or do you think that he would do whatever he could to preserve his own being, even if it meant the destruction of everybody else?
Well, he would preserve himself at the destruction of everyone else. But even if he were eventually truly cornered, that he saw no way out than to destroy all others and himself, that is a very close possibility compared to a normal individual. And that's why the situation is so dangerous. They have the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Don't have to repeat that, but this situation is extremely dangerous. And in fact, we've averted many more near world annihilations than we would like to imagine. I think accidents alone are 13 counts. And so to have these weapons in the hands of someone who is actually prone to violence, not wise as maybe some former leaders might have been. This is not our Cuban Missile Crisis moment. We have to be aware of just how perilous this instance is.
I think that's wise advice. Nick, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, there's a certain vindictiveness, and oftentimes narcissists and sociopaths they're very punitively oriented. They're very. You see this a lot with Trump. It's often, it's punish other people, and then it's victimhood when they themselves are punished. And so, this vindictive. We've often heard if Trump gets another term, that it's basically going to be a vindictive revenge tour as he goes around and kind of, basically settle scores with all his political enemies. Well, in a similar vein with Putin is that, if he's worth $200 million, but he's, looking at sitting in The Hague, well, what does he care if the world isn't around? His existence is basically gone. It's similar to, the murder suicide of a husband, whose wife's about to leave him. If I can't have her, nobody else is. And even if you do make some type of peace agreement with Putin, ultimately his mindset, his psychology is he's pissed off that he didn't get, as I talked about, he didn't get 100%. He's not viewing this as a win. He's viewing this as, I was prevented from getting what I wanted, and I want more. Just like he probably viewed when he just got Crimea, when he was in Syria. I don't think that at any point he's going to be satisfied. That's not how that's just not how his psychology works. It's narcissism is insatiable. And so it doesn't matter what he gets in a peace deal, it's not going to be enough.
Robert J. Lifton wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago. He offered at the end of his piece, he basically said that he thought that Putin was sort of beyond reason or beyond influence was the term he used. And that, he might not be kind of, open to any kind of sane negotiations or even to, the input of reality into his worldview. And he closed by saying, like, I think we need to figure out some kind of a way to give him an off ramp where he thinks that he's won, or at least that he's achieved some kind of subset of the goals that he's set out to achieve. And I loved his piece because I feel like he diagnosed it perfectly, but I'm not so sure about the prescription because I don't know what that would look like. And it makes me very nervous because it feels to me like I guess, a stalemate of some kind, or that we're going to somehow or other lose that.
Instead of saying Putin's insane, Putin is a dictator, I think of as a political cult leader who was raised in an authoritarian regime. Then he went into the KGB, and his cult self is on automatic pilot to restore Russia's greatness. And so if we're going to talk strategy for what to do, we have to think about entering his model of reality and the Russian people's models of reality. And we need to come up with some solutions for how to convey information. I think the closest analogy is Adolf Hitler here. And so when people say, well, let's appease them, let's negotiate, he'll be satisfied, I don't buy that at all. I think he's on automatic pilot to recover all of the lost lands of the Soviet Union and the glory of Stalin. So I'm afraid that unless we can come up with some really creative alternatives, force is going to be needed. And that's what I've heard from former Russian experts. It's like you can't say to someone like Putin, let's play nice, because he will lie and he will do what he wants to do. My perception is we've been reacting when we should be proactive. And the one thing about cult leaders and cults is if you understand the leader and you understand the ideology, you can predict pretty assuredly how they're going to act under any situation. And I'm just not seeing that vision. The average person can't comprehend the mindset of a psychopath. That's exactly right. People need to understand how dangerous this is. And if Putin is saying, yeah, we can nuke Poland, in my opinion, unless he knows he's going to get nuked back, if he pulls that thing, he may try it because the weakness that has been conveyed.
The first rule is to believe the authoritarian when they tell you what they're going to do. He has been saying what he's intending to do here for quite some time. And, we've been seeing that this war was incoming for like 8 years. And, everybody was kind of like, well, he's probably not going to invade. It's like, no, dude, he's going to invade. He would not have invested all of this time and energy the last 8 years if there was not something coming down the road.
We have to deal with it as someone who should not be engaged in a rational way, someone who should not be interacted with in a way that we would with another healthy person. That containment has to come from the outside, and that's often how I view the dealing of violent individuals, in that they often don't let on that they are in fact crying out for containment, that they somehow cannot control themselves, and that they feel comforted when the limits and containment come from the outside. They have to be assured that they will be taken care of, but and that's what their actions are crying out for. That speaks to the limitlessness of their actions. If you think of a toddler, actually, there are stages of moral development and cognitive development, and we can see violent individuals as often having been arrested at age 5 or less. That's where the might makes right mentality comes from, and they have to win at all costs in order to be right and to be okay. That they really are crying out for containment, and I fear that we have missed a lot of opportunities, and the more opportunities we miss, the more emboldened they will be and the more dangerous they are. Same with Putin, and this is the peril we face for not holding mental health and psychological knowledge to be important in all human affairs.